podcast, A Penny for Your Thoughts with me, Steve Penny. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be talking to some great people. I hope you enjoy listening in. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say welcome, Josh, to my podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I think it's going to be an interesting one, as you'll have a different perspective to the old, jaded version of me that's sitting in front of you right now. So if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief intro of who you are and what you currently do, and then we'll start going through each of the different parts of the questions that I've got to start this conversation. So over to you.
Yeah, fabulous. So, ko waio, e kōrero ake nei, ka harewa mai taku manu I ngā whenua o Europa, no Huiterangi, no Ingarangi, no Kotirangi, rere arorangi nei taku manu I te kōtehi o Tarikaka, e haro nei I runga ake o te whanganui ātara, te tumu herenga waka I ai te waka whakarai o Waitangi, ka haere tonu te manu ki tōna kāinga o Ōtautahi, e noho nei au, ko Blackmore tōku whānau, ko Josh tōku ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So my name's Josh Blackmore, I'm 26. Some may call that young, some may call that old, but I'm somewhere in the middle. I grew up in Wellington.
At the start.
Yeah. So I grew up in Wellington, surrounded by family in a house my father built at the bottom of Mount Kakao. I feel I had a very stereotypical old-fashioned upbringing. Went to play rugby on Saturdays, and every public holiday we'd jump in the camper van and go camping or off to the batch somewhere. I did all my growing up in high school in Wellington, and then decided to go study engineering down at the University of Canterbury. So I moved down to Christchurch to do that. And then as I was moving through and graduating, I sort of figured that becoming an engineer in a city that was going through a major rebuild after the earthquakes wasn't a bad place to be. So I started my career here too, and have been here ever since. Professionally, I'm a kaipuhanga hiko, or an electrical building services engineer in the WSP team in Christchurch. I started there 5-ish years ago, progressing from being a brand new graduate through to now having a pretty cool role and leading some multidisciplinary projects and some pretty complex situations. So yeah, really enjoying that.
Excellent. It's good to hear. So your home life, you're living, you're flatting down here?
All my family's still in Wellington. I live with my wife, Christina. We recently married as of a little over a year ago. So yeah, just starting to, thank you. Starting to set up our own lives here with us and our dog as our household at the moment. I love being in Canterbury. It's close to the mountains, and I spare time into trail running, rock climbing, mountaineering, all that sort of stuff. And it's really good to have all that so accessible, only a short drive away.
Wellington's got its own attractions, but I think that if you're an outdoorsy person, you can't really go wrong with Christchurch. There's so much going on around us. Okay, cool. In terms of the career path you're on, you're obviously quite close to the beginning of your career. What was it that influenced you to become an electrical building services engineer?
In hindsight, I think it's a bit unsurprising that I ended up being an engineer. I've always been surrounded by practical people. My father's an engineer. My grandfather was a carpenter. My other grandfather he worked in banking and in investment, but was always a great conversation starter of what's the current project. So forever tinkering away in the garage or working on this, that, or the other. For me, I remember in my schooling in graphics and design or tech drawing, we would be doing lots of exercises around ideating around the space and form of something, and you'd be drawing inspiration from this tree or that way that animal moves, and everyone would be drawing these great elaborate artistic conceptual pieces, and then you come around to my side of the table and it would all be square straight lines, boxes laid out on a grid. So I think it was pretty clear that I was going to end up being an engineer based on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, was there any point in time where you thought that you might do something else, or has it just always been a focus?
When I was younger, I did want to be a writer, actually, or a journalist, something in that field. I really liked learning and sharing stories and helping shine light on some of the world's problems. And so, as a young kid, that was my ambition. As I matured, I think I realized that my skill set aligned more towards engineering, but still with a lot of the same drivers. So still seeing lots of challenges out in the world, but instead of writing about them and telling people about, I saw my mathsy, physicsy, sciencey brain lending more towards engineering and helping to solve them in that way.
Finding solutions,
like lots of the work I do now is public sector, so schools, hospitals, corrections, transport, that sort of thing. And it's really clear where the impact of our work is. So you hear so often in the news and in the world about some big challenges the world's facing around healthcare crisis and educating our young people. And me being an engineer and trying to design and refurbish some really cool facilities for those sectors is one way in which I do my bit, or I feel I'm doing my bit to help with some of those challenges.
It's similar to myself. I've found that the projects I get the most personal satisfaction out of are the stuff I'm doing at the moment with the tertiary education sector, because it's a positive impact on the environment, but it's also giving people, a good environment to work and learn in. But also the healthcare side of things. I did a lot of healthcare. First 10 years I was in New Zealand, plus the previous 10 or 15 years prior to that was all healthcare work. And I've always found that to be the most satisfying, because you can see that it has an immediate positive impact on the community around, whereas doing an office fit out doesn't quite have the same impact, I find.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's really cool. We can get a job where it's really tangible, the outcomes.
Yeah.
And saying that there's something to be drawn from every job.
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
Commercial office block, you might
Yep.
be able to go and save that building so many percentage of energy, which is a heap of carbon when you're having an impact in that way. So
Yeah, that's true. That is true. I mean, I think as building services engineers as well, it's part of our role to make sure that we are using the energy that's available as efficiently as possible. And I think that we do lose sight of that sometimes, but it's certainly a driver for me. And it's looking at the project as a whole, not just as what's the electrical discipline doing, what's the hydraulics discipline doing, what's the mechanical, but what about the architects and the facades? How are we using the daylight most effectively? All that kind of stuff still feels to me like it should be part of our scope, because it impacts on the way the building's used. But yeah, okay, cool. In terms of challenges up to date, what would you say is one of the biggest challenges that you personally have faced?
Yeah, I saw this one in your list and was trying to think about how I would answer it. I think, like many people who move away from home to study, I'll probably lean on that as my example here. Like I alluded to earlier, grew up in a really supportive home environment with a great group of friends and a great supportive family all living nearby. And I leaned on that a lot. I'd always come from home and from school or whatever and have this challenge and talk it through with mum and dad and brother and sister and come up with an idea. And even if it all went belly up, I'd still have that to fall back on.
Okay.
It was a big challenge moving down to Christchurch and not having that, and whilst at the same time trying to figure out a bit who I was as a man rather than as a teenager. And so it sort of took maybe a couple of years to figure out who I was and what I was about and what I wanted to do, changed my hobbies and what I did in my spare time a bit, and things like the Student Volunteer Army were really good for giving me a bit of purpose there, as well as investing really heavily into my studies. So I think in hindsight that was probably one of the bigger challenges I've been through.
I think it's something that when you do move away from home, it forces you to grow up a lot quicker, I think, because you suddenly have a lot more responsibility than you had when you was living at home. And I think it's no bad thing for everybody to get out of home at a relatively young age, because otherwise you sort of become too reliant, I think, on your family and you don't find your own feet. So good on you for doing it, though, because it can be quite scary. I know as a parent myself, when my youngest daughter, Lucy, decided that she wanted to be a vet and was going to go up to Palmy, the idea of her moving away from home and living up in Palmy was a bit daunting for us, but I mean, I'm really pleased that she's done it, because it's been very good for her, and I think it's a great thing to do, and I think you should be justifiably proud of yourself for being brave enough to do it, mate. It's good.
I was going to say it's certainly not something that's particularly unique, but it's something that a lot of people go through, and whether it's moving the next town over or to a different island like I did, or halfway around the world, it gives you opportunity to grow up really quick.
It does, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think it's easy to think it's to belittle the challenge that is for anybody, really, but when you first leave home, it's a big thing. It is a big thing without a doubt. So I wouldn't belittle it at all. It takes a bit of guts to do it. So good on you for that. You did briefly mention the Student Volunteer Army, which is something that I knew about you from when I was talking to you. We was our summer intern way back when, 6 years ago or something like that. I'd like to really sort of dig into that a little bit more and find out a little bit more about how you got involved with that group and the sort of things that you were doing as part of the Volunteer Army. So how did you get involved in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. So when the Christchurch earthquakes happened in 2010 and 11, I was still in high school up in Wellington, but watching what was going on down there, just in shock at this place that I'd visited and knew, and then all of a sudden it was being broadcast around the world in this terrible situation, and didn't draw my eyes away really. But like many people watching on at that point, I was really inspired by how the young people stepped up and took charge and accountability and had a real impact there for the lives of some people who were doing it pretty tough. So for those who don't know the story, after the earthquakes, there was obviously a lot of damage, but it was in some ways quite localized. There was a lot of damage around the city centre where all the buildings fell down, and then there was several other pockets where there was the mass liquefaction, this big bubbly, gluggy, ugly mess of silt and water that seeped up through the ground and filled everyone's streets and driveways and backyards. But one of the areas that wasn't so much affected was Riccarton and Ilam, in the area around the university, where the students had only started their lectures. It may have been the week before. And so you had this mass cohort of young people in the city looking at it in the state all around them, but where they were was okay, but they couldn't go to university because all their lectures were shut down and the buildings were being inspected. So there was a few people thought, what can we do about this? We're a whole bunch of young people. We don't have a huge amount of skills or resources, but we've got a lot of bodies. So let's get out there and do something. So they started door knocking with shovel and wheelbarrow in hand and just got to work and started moving some of that silt. And that's probably what they're most known for, but it was also, standing up bookshelves and helping people move stuff that had fallen over and those really simple, practical things to get people's lives back on track. And it snowballed and it snowballed and it snowballed, and more people kept showing up day after day until they had thousands doing this. It became this real symbol of earthquake resilience and the community stepping up to support those who were doing it tough. So a few years down the track, when I came down to the University of Canterbury to start my studies, I was aware of that history and quite excited to see that the Student Volunteer Army was still going. The immediate need of the earthquake had passed, but as anyone who works in volunteering or charity work knows, there's always a need for something.
Absolutely.
So the SVA, the Student Volunteer Army shortens to SVA, was known, had this mass resource of people that can sort of be thrown at any challenge, but was quite unique in that sort of charity volunteer space as being an organisation without much of a cause except helping people. So we're really adaptable to throwing themselves at anything that needed to be done. So I got involved at a time where it was reimagining itself and trying to put itself in a position to be successful ongoing and not just ride the high of the earthquake experience, and was involved with the start of some really cool initiatives. They do camps and that sort of thing now where they go away and throw 100, 150 people at a town and do half a dozen projects over a weekend. And that's a really cool experience to link students with a community that they may not have been to before. And then all of a sudden, restoring their cenotaph or working in the food bank or painting the wall at the local skate park or something like that. And it's a really cool way to connect people with a community they may not have been to before. One of the other things that happened quite early on in my involvement was the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake. It was actually if I remember correctly, it was in the middle of the night on a Sunday evening, and I just moved flat that day out of the halls into my first flat. And the next day on the Monday, I was going to start my summer internship where I was pulling cables as an electrician. And the earthquake happened that day. And then all of a sudden, all the wheels of the SVA start turning, and we're at that point expected to respond. When we've got all these people, we've got this reputation, there's this massive need that's happened. What can we do? Obviously, quite a lot harder with the state that the country was in that point, and the access was a massive challenge. We couldn't do what we did in Christchurch and send busloads of people up. We had to think a bit more creatively. So in some ways, we became a conduit, ferrying people with resources to those who could get into the area, getting messages out. But the niche that we found ourselves nicely in and were able to have a real impact was supporting all the tourists and other people who were being evacuated out.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which was another task that needed just a mass resource of people. So a group of people going down to the wharfs to help the Defence Force load people on and off the Navy ships that were ferrying people back and forth from Kaikoura, and then we would bring them to the university, and it happened over the summer holidays, so the halls of residence were empty at the time. So we set up University Hall, one of the big halls of residence at the University of Canterbury, as a bit of a base where it was mostly tourists who were stuck in Kaikoura, got evacuated out, housed at the University Hall for as long as they needed to get themselves back on their feet, figure out where they were going to go next. Some of them jumped on a plane straight home. Some others went and picked up another camper van and carried on their holidays.
Carried on their trips, yeah.
Yeah, that was a hugely rewarding experience for me to have a role in coordinating some of that. Yeah, it was the most bizarre time. I'd be getting up and going to work and doing my 8 hours and working contractor hours, so finishing sort of mid-afternoon, and then going to the SVA office. We had a house next door to the campus at the university, and would work until the early hours trying to coordinate this mass volunteer effort to support people who were doing it pretty tough in Kaikoura. Yeah, and so you've done a lot for
a 26-year-old.
Yeah. So after
really,
that, the bug was there, and I got more and more into it, and we started doing more and more cool things. There was that crisis natural disaster response stuff, and then when times were a bit more stable, we'd be just going out on the weekends and planting some trees, painting over some graffiti, going and volunteering at a school, all sorts of different stuff. Yeah, it was incredibly rewarding.
Did you get involved with the fires?
Yep. So 2017 or 18 from memory, somewhere around there was quite a significant fire up on the Port Hills that burnt through a lot of bush. Similar story, big event, needed a big volunteer response. We had a lot of people who could and wanted to help. So there's lots of organisations involved in that one, Summit Road Society, Dock Council, various others who needed some hands to go and plant some trees to stabilise the slopes. So we threw a lot of people at that. The other thing that fires do is they expose what's underneath, and in a lot of cases that's a lot of rubbish and litter. So when we've done fire responses, there's also a need to go around with lots of big black rubbish bags and clear that out too. So we did that as well.
We do like to ruin our environment, us humans, don't we?
Yep.
And so, I mean, you're not involved with the Student Volunteer Army anymore, are you?
Not on an active basis. I mean, there's various people from the organisation that, less so these days, but were around when I was around, who occasionally tap in for advice. Probably the biggest mobilisation in recent times that pulled on a lot of previous student leadership resource was in the early days of the COVID lockdowns, when, same story, big national event, lots of needed lots of resource. And so a few of us old hands got pulled back in and worked with the leadership at that time to set up a nationwide grocery delivery service for people who couldn't leave their homes at that point in time, or before vaccination, it was the at-risk populations, people with pre-existing conditions and the elderly, and for people for whatever reason couldn't or didn't want to leave their homes or didn't feel safe to do so. So there was a mass mobilisation at that point to go and set up a grocery delivery service for people that couldn't go out and shop for themselves. So we did that, and that was probably the last significant involvement I had.
Yeah, well, that's still pretty significant. I mean, just I have to ask that there's a lot of pressure on engineering students just from the curriculum that you're facing. How did you find the time to do the volunteering stuff? Because it is pretty time consuming trying to organise a large group of people. I know from my own experience it can take a lot of time. So how did you manage to balance the time to keep doing the study and fit in all the volunteering work?
I I certainly don't try and hide away from it. It was an enormous amount of work, but what it also had was an incredible culture of people trying to do the right thing and asking volunteers to work well in a team. It comes very natural to them. So we had a team of 30 when I was president of that organisation, running the general activities and the response to these various significant events, and that was an awesome team to be a part of. If you ever want an example of a team that runs well, it was that one. Everybody was pitching in. If someone was having a big assignment week or a big exam week, then they'd take a step back and others would just immediately come to the fore and
awesome.
Pack up the load.
There's some leadership lessons for a lot of other people, for people outside the volunteer army there, I would say, that high performing teams do tend to have one another's back a lot more than low performing teams. It's very true. So how many people at the peak were involved in the SVA then? So you got 30 people running it.
Yep. So when I was involved, we had a crew of about 3,000 people, a little north of 3,000 people who had signed up through the University of Canterbury. Then as the organisation grew national, there was about 3,000 people across the country, again, who were helping with the grocery delivery service. Okay. And then we also ran a number of other outreach programs in high schools, primary schools, so on, that the number just kept snowballing. And I believe now they've got various setups at most of the major tertiary institutions and a number of high schools around the country. So it just keeps going.
That's a very big organisation,
Wow. It's very cool, and one that's very, very close to my heart. So it's good to see it go from strength to strength.
Absolutely, yes. I think it's an amazing thing that UC started, but it seems obviously now it's a national thing, which I hadn't realised. So that's amazing. Are you able to send me through some sort of links and details of the SVA so that I can post that in the show notes for the podcast? Just
of course, yep.
Because people will be interested and they may want to help in some way. So if I can include that link, I will do. It's always good to share that information around. What has driven you to be wanting to provide so much back into your community? What's the driver behind that for you? Is that like a family trait of yours, or is it something that's just that you've been inspired by somebody else or something else in your life?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a factor that comes from my upbringing, very much role modeled by my parents. They were, or they still are, very much people that if you're engaging with an organisation or with an opportunity, then there's an expectation on yourself to give back to that, or at least to give that opportunity to others. Yeah. So as example, growing up, we all played rugby. Mum was out there. She was volunteering as the club treasurer. I did scouting growing up, and Dad was a Kia leader. Me and my brother and my sister did rowing through high school, and Dad was down there driving the boat trailers and fixing the outboards and the coach boats, and Mum was running the club committee again. That sort of role modelling really set the scene for me to, all right, if I'm taking part in something, I need to be contributing to it. I also think there's an element of me being where I am and how lucky I've been to have the opportunities I've had and the supportive networks I have, and through things such as the SVA, being able to look out at the world and realise that others don't necessarily have that. There's an expectation that I feel on myself to try and make up for that, and to support those, and not necessarily just people, but places and the environment and other such things, causes that I have an ability to affect, so therefore almost have a responsibility to do so, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that's something that Western society in particular is very bad at, is recognising that you've got a role to play in supporting those around you, whether they're part of your family group or not. You look at other societies, you look at the way that the Maori culture runs, it's all about the family, and the whānau is actually a lot more than just the people that are in the immediate family. It's everyone in the village, or everyone in the town, or everyone in the city, wherever they may be. And And I think that we Westerners, certainly from my upbringing, we're a much more nucleus-sized family, mum and dad and the kids, and that's it. And that's all you're responsible for. And I think you lose something when you focus that inwards. And, from my own point of view, finding opportunities to actually help the wider community is something I keep trying to do. I keep trying to do different things. And I think it's great to see somebody as young as yourself actually already doing that as well. I've gone through my life looking for opportunities and not really finding them, whereas you seem to have found quite a few opportunities yourself. So I'm quite jealous, really, that you managed to achieve so much at such a young age.
I think you flatter me very much.
No, just seriously, it's impressive what you've done. There's a lot of people at your age that haven't done anywhere near as much for their local communities. So something to be rightfully proud of, for sure. Asking about influences now. So, your parents, by the sound of it, are quite strong influences. Is there anybody else that you would say was a big influence on your life?
Oh, absolutely. My wife is a massive one, obviously, as I've grown, and, we've been together 7 years now. Yeah, as my relationship grows with her, that she's an awesome influence too. She's kind of the flip side of my parents. My parents are very much, you've got this certain set of skills and opportunities. It's great to get out there and to do something with it. And that's awesome. And that's allowed me to go and chase a lot of things and do a lot of cool stuff. But it also is a very quick path to burnout and to big mental health challenges and everything that goes along with that. My wife is very good at grounding me and reminding me about what's really important, and that bearing myself for that deadline that the PM is not going to look at for another 2 days isn't necessarily the most important thing in the world, and that I've got a responsibility to her and to my family and to myself to look after myself as well. So yeah, she's a role models that behaviour in a really good way for me, and is a great influence in that way.
Yeah, well, that's great. Anybody else outside of family?
Yeah, I mean, there's people I see all around me whose traits I admire, and career and outlook on life, and that I want to replicate. Looking around the office at people whose work ethic, whose output, and that I admire. There's certain people that come to mind whose approach to engineering, if we want to talk about that, is something that I really admire and want to replicate in my own conduct and my own output. The type of people that focus on getting it right 100% of the time, and therefore have a reputation for doing so, who can be relied upon for diving into a problem, whether they're contracted to or not, but just want to find the solution and get the right outcome for everybody in the end. And those are traits that I'm trying to pick up.
I think it's with the engineering career, there's really the only thing that you produce, the output that you produce is really what people judge you by. So you're right to focus on trying to get it as right as you can, but there is a balance to that there's the 80-20 rule that people talk about, that you can get it, never going to get it perfect. It's really a case of finding the way to spend your time the most effectively, and then making sure that if there are shortfalls in what you're doing, that you communicate those shortfalls to explain why. And if you do that, then most of the time the clients will be understanding of that situation. But yeah, I think you're right. Striving for perfection is great, but just don't ever expect to get there, because human beings are never perfect, unfortunately. And I think you can tie yourself in knots trying to get everything right. There's a point at which there's a real diminishing return on the effort you're putting in. So, but that's cool. That's good. What do you do outside of work? It doesn't sound like you have a great deal of free time between volunteering and working, but what do you do to recharge your batteries?
So for me, it's getting into the outdoors. I find that when I go home and just sit on the couch, that you often end up ruminating the challenges of the day in your head. And so for me, I really need to get myself outside into nature, do something physical, which can always be hard. It can be really hard at the end of a big session to go home and force yourself to go out on a run. It's in the dark and
it's raining,
whatever else. Absolutely. But yeah, for me, the runs during the week, getting out on the weekend into the forest, into the rivers, into the snow, the challenges of the week can feel a mile away when all you're worried about is how are you going to clamber over that next boulder in front of you, and how you're going to manage that tricky little snow slope and that sort of thing. So for me, that's one way I do it. And the other way is just connecting with people, having a really strong supportive family network, friends, and connecting with them. There's lots of good people in my life that I draw a lot of energy from when I'm struggling. So spending time with them is another way I think I do to manage that too.
I guess if there's one person, a historical figure that's either dead or alive, or somebody that you think of as a really important person in your life that you'd like to have a conversation with but never have, who would that be?
In my own life, it would probably be my grandfather. He passed when I was sort of coming out of my childhood, so it's sort of 15 odd years ago. But I only ever really had a child grandfather relationship with him, and he was the one there was a builder that was alluded to earlier. I would be really interested to have a conversation with him and understand what he thinks about the choices that I've made and the life that I'm creating for myself, and even things as simple as my wife and I bought our first house a couple of years ago, and it would have been really useful or insightful to have his guidance through that process. And so as far as someone close to me and that I knew, that would be them. Famous people, historical figures, there's a long list of people I think who would be really interesting to sit down and have a conversation with. The likes of your Mandela, Barack Obama, closer to home people like Fina Cooper, the type of people that stood up, took a chance, made a difference in the world. It'd be really interesting to have a conversation. And
very selfless people, I think, aren't they? All of those very selfless people putting themselves at risk for the benefit of others, which not many of the leaders in the world do nowadays, unfortunately. Way too much selfishness in our leaders at the moment. Do you read much? Are you much of a reader?
Oh, when I can. I wish I read a lot more than I do.
It doesn't sound like you've got a great deal of spare time to sit down and read a book. So are you reading anything at the moment?
Yep. So my favourite book of the moment, which I was given a couple of years ago and I've read about 3 times since, is a book called Uprising by a guy called Nick Lowe. He's half Pākehā, half Ngāi Tahu, and grew up similar to my interest, always out in nature, always around the mountains, tramping, climbing, that sort of thing. And the story is a bit of that. It's of him going out and doing these awesome adventures, but the motivation for doing so is him discovering his Māori heritage. He's talking to people and figuring out, for example, the old greenstone trails that Māori used to take through the Southern Alps to get to the West Coast, and then going and following them and using all the modern day tools and equipment, but going on a bit of a journey of discovery and learning all of the stories of the rivers and the valleys and the mountains and all of the pūrākau and kōrero that goes along with those. And that's been really insightful for me. I'm not Māori, I'm he Pākehā aho, but too have spent a lot of time in the hills but not really known the stories. You might see a name of a governor from the colonial government 100 odd years ago and go, I recognise a Bearley or a Morehouse or a Fitzgerald or something like that. But I've found through reading that book and some of the other study I'm doing at the moment, really insightful to learn more about the stories of the land before us white people arrived, and how
we have a lot to answer for.
Yeah, of course, but how that connects to they're not just stories. There's always a purpose to it. What's the lesson? How does it relate to the world, the seasons, the signals of the weather, or when you should be planting this, harvesting that? What tree's good for what purpose? All of the stories that come, or the lessons that come from those stories. It's incredible. So that book, Uprising, is one man's journey to just start to discover some of that, and that's what I've really enjoyed in that regard.
I mean, I've started doing a bit of that discovery myself of late, looking at my family tree and doing some research on ancestry.com and trying to sort of tie in where I come from, because a lot of the conversations I've been having with people have been about that, finding that connection to the community and to where they live. And I think there's quite a lot to be said for having that connection. It gives you somewhere to build on. Now, if you don't have that solid foundation, then it's difficult to build a life, I think. Being an immigrant as I am and having no real family here other than the people that are in my household, finding that connection and finding that base is quite important. As I'm getting older and approaching the sort of the end of my career, it's really a time for me to reflect and think about what do I want to leave behind and how do I want to communicate that and all of those things that I guess as you start to reach towards retirement, you start to think about those things. But I think there's a lot to be said for having that connection and understanding where you come from and what motivates you is really important, I think, for you to make when you're making decisions in your life. Do you do a lot of travel outside of New Zealand? Have you done a lot of travel outside New Zealand?
Yep, I've certainly tried to. It's been a bit hard in the last few years, but
COVID's made it a bit challenging.
Oh, absolutely. There's so many people I know who are all around the world at the moment who have been queuing up for the last couple of years, and now all of a sudden they're in Vancouver or they're in Southeast Asia or they're in Europe, and you haven't done your OE yet, I guess, have you? I've never done the working OE and probably won't in that sort of way. I'm aging grandparents and wanting to stay close to family and wouldn't want to leave the dog and that sort of thing. So don't think I'll ever go and do 2 years working overseas. But my wife and I are in the midst of planning a couple of months away next year
Oh, nice.
which we're very excited about. Bit
Where
of
are
a
you off
delayed
to?
honeymoon because we couldn't
Yeah.
travel immediately after the wedding. Very stereotypical. We'll be heading off to Europe. Yeah, I've got family based out of London, so it'll be great to go and connect with them. It's been a few years since I've seen that crew, and
Yeah.
then get over to the continent, see some the usuals, the old churches, the Roman this, the
So you'll be going to
medieval
Italy
town
then?
centres. Yeah, and then also whilst we're still reasonably young, getting out into the mountains and skiing
Yeah.
in the Alps and
Oh, nice, yeah.
tramping through the Dolomites, and we're hoping to get up to Scandinavia and that sort of thing too. But
Cool.
yeah, all very wonderful ideas at this point, early stages of planning. So hopefully some or most of it comes to fruition.
Chrissy and my wife and I, we had a trip planned to go to Italy for about 6 weeks in 2020, which obviously didn't happen because we was due to be there in July, and we were watching the news in March and seeing Italy destroying itself with the pandemic, unfortunately. So that's been on hold ever since, and we're now planning to do that trip next year because our goal is to actually retire to Italy and buy property in Tuscany and enjoy our sunset years traveling around Europe from that location. So yeah, Europe's a great place to spend time. There's so much to see and do, and there's a massive amount of history, and I know there's always the ties to the colonialism and that as well, but I think that knowing that and seeing the history that's there is valuable because it's something you can learn from. There was a lot of mistakes that were made, a lot of things that were done that shouldn't have been done, but if you don't recognize that and don't see where it came from, then you're likely to repeat those mistakes, I think, as a society. So but it's the fact that we as a human race have been around for as long as we have, and there's evidence of it for thousands of years, which you don't really get here in New Zealand. I know you do in Australia with the Aborigine people for sort of going back 30,000-40,000 years. There's evidence of them living there. But for New Zealand and for me in particular, I feel like I need that history as well, just to find my place, I guess. So is there anywhere in particular that you really want to get to when you're on your travels? Is there like a number one place that you really want to go?
Yeah, I mean, that keeps flip-flopping as I look into other things, and other things excite me, and each thing I stumble across excites me. I mean, like you, I'm gone on a bit of a family history discovery journey lately, so there'll be an element of a trip where we're walking around small towns in Scotland looking at where great-great-grandfather grew up, and that holds a lot of interest and excitement for me. And then there's other stuff where we've got friends who are in the Dolomites this week, who are sending back just the most glorious pictures of beautiful bright blue lakes and sheer mountains, and and that makes me really excited to go and explore some of the natural tourism that the European continent's got to offer as well.
Yeah, it should be a great trip. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Yeah, we might see you in Italy. You never know.
Yeah.
Okay, so music. Are you a musical person, Josh? Do you enjoy music?
Very much a consumer, an awful participant. I'm always the last to. The last person you want to hand the microphone to on karaoke night because the bar will empty.
Yeah, I'm glad it's not just me. So who's your favourite artist at the moment then?
We're on a bit of an Ed Sheeran bent at the moment. Went and saw him in concert when he was over in New Zealand earlier this year. So he's just put out a new album. We went up and spent a weekend up there, saw him and saw the family, which was great. He's the flavour of the moment, but
very talented man. We saw him down here. We saw him down here in the arena, and he's an incredibly talented guy. So we actually had tickets for that concert, but we couldn't get accommodation and flights sorted out because we booked the tickets, or Chrissy booked the tickets, and didn't realise that it was Waitangi weekend, I think, wasn't it? And everything was booked, and it was we were looking at flights costing us $700 each, and then not being able to find accommodation. So we ended up giving the tickets to one of the family. It was so expensive. Too much money to spend for going to see Ed Sheeran, that's for sure. One last question I have is what's an unpopular opinion that you hold, and why do you hold it? Or do you have an unpopular opinion? Just thought I'd throw a bit of a curveball at you there.
Oh, good question. I'm sure I do. Good question. I mean, one of the journeys that I've gone on in the past year is around. We talked a little about Māori and Te Ao Māori in this conversation, but one of the journeys that I've gone on in the last 3 or 4 years or so, but particularly in the last 2, is learning that language and more about the value that the Māori viewpoint can add to our society, and even more focused to the engineering world and the work that we do to design infrastructure for society. For so long, there's quite strong evidence that things like our corrections facilities, our education, our hospitals, and so on are underserved Māori. So it would be strange to look at that and then go, there's absolutely nothing that we can do in designing these facilities differently to better serve people of Māori heritage. So my probably unpopular opinion would be that we need to do a heck of a lot more than we're doing that that sort of stuff than we're doing at the moment, and that's quite disruptive to the mindset of plenty of engineers who have been doing things a certain way for so long.
But there's no. I mean, I think that disruption is key to us all growing and developing. That there's the point in time at which you say that there's nothing else I can learn is the time at which you stop growing as a person, and I don't think you ever stop learning really. And challenging the norm is the best way to get the best design. It's very easy from an engineering perspective. It's very easy to take the last design and copy and paste because it's easy and quick and convenient and it's low risk. But if that's not giving the best outcome, then challenging that and trying to find a better way to do things that is aligned with the needs of the people that's going to use the facility is something that I think we should all do better at. There's been a lot of change in the healthcare space around the style of the facilities to be more focused on the patient and less focused on the people providing the care, because there's a lot of studies to show that the patient recovers better if the space is designed for them. So I think that there's a lot to be said for taking that perspective. And that you mentioned room data sheets, but the one thing you don't get out of room data sheet is what do the people that's in the space actually want. And certainly as an engineer growing up, I learned fairly quickly from some good bosses that I had that the best thing to do is speak to your client before you do anything and actually understand their needs and find out what it is that they actually want out of the space before you put pen to paper. Having those conversations at the right time, speaking to the right people, getting that right feedback is absolutely key to giving the right outcomes, I think.
Absolutely.
Good on you for that.
Yeah, we've got to remember that we're not designing for switchboards and AHUs and pipes and cables for the heck of it. We're not even really designing for clients. We're designing for teachers and students and patients and nurses and doctors and members of society in general. And whilst we can get very tied up in how cool all of the technology is and this new fun
what's
solution,
the lux level on the desk surface and how many ways have we got in the switchboard, none of that really matters if what you're providing doesn't suit the needs of the people using the space.
Absolutely.
And I think certainly in my experience for nearly 40 years in this industry, it's very rare that you get users of the space complaining about the colour of the walls or the size of the windows. Most of the time they complain that the lighting's wrong or the heating's wrong or the ventilation's wrong. So what we do, services engineers, is kind of the frontline stuff that people complain about. So I think understanding that brief and making sure you've got a good view on what people want is absolutely essential. Josh, I can't believe it's been an hour and 10 minutes, but it's been an hour and 10 minutes that we've been talking, which is fantastic. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with me before we go?
Anything not really.
That I haven't touched on, no?
Just a big thank you for having a conversation. It's been good to sit down and have a talk with you for an hour and 10 minutes. And
it's good to catch up with you, Josh, as well. I've been following your career with interest, and it's good to see that you're doing so well for yourself, mate. And I wish we'd had the chance to work together a bit longer than we did, but you never know. There's still plenty of.
You do never know.
So look after yourself, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to my podcast, A Penny for Your Thoughts, with me, Steve Penny. I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation, and I look forward to sharing my next conversation with you in the future. Thank you.